The bell rang again just as the clock's minute hand touched the same quiet place it had touched the night before, its sharp chime slicing through the dark house with a precision that felt deliberate, as though someone had been standing on the other side of my door counting down the seconds until I turned toward the sound. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 72 years old, and this is my story. Before we continue, please tell me where you are watching from and subscribe to Her Legacy Tales, a place proving our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the beginning. That night, the house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that does not come from silence alone, but from the sense that something is listening back. I had settled into my armchair with a blanket over my legs, the room dim except for the soft lamp in the corner. I remember the faint hum of the refrigerator, the low sigh of the wind brushing against the windows, the ticking clock that had belonged to my husband. The world felt balanced in that gentle way evenings sometimes do, until the moment everything shifted. I did not know why I glanced toward the entryway before the bell rang. Perhaps instinct moves before thought in women my age, especially those who have lived long enough to recognize the shape of unease when it passes through a room. My breath paused without reason. I sat a little straighter. Something beneath the quiet seemed to tighten. Then the bell cut through the air, one sharp chime, not frantic, not hesitant, precise. I rose slowly, feeling an odd heaviness in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me in a line of faint shadows. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet, the sound strangely loud in the stillness. When I reached the door, I paused with my hand on the knob. I do not know why. I had answered countless knocks and bells in my life. But that night, something urged me to listen first. Nothing. Not footsteps. Not retreating gravel. Not a whispered apology. Not the faint rustle of clothing brushing against the bushes. Only the steady breath of the winter night. I opened the door. The porch lay empty beneath the pale light of the lamp. The railing cast long, gentle shadows across the wooden boards. The yard was undisturbed, the grass faintly glittering with dew. The path held no impressions. The air carried no scent of another presence. Yet I knew the bell had rung. I stepped out slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the faint glow from the streetlight. The world was calm, unbothered, entirely unaware that something had come and gone in the space of a single breath. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down. No footprints. Not one. If I had stopped there, perhaps none of what followed would have happened. I closed the door quietly, locking it out of habit rather than fear. The living room felt different when I returned, as if the walls had absorbed the sound of the bell and held it there, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I sank into my chair and listened to the silence. My mind traveled through possible explanations: a prank, a malfunctioning bell, a neighbor. Yet none of those answers settled into place. The bell had a certain firmness to its chime, the kind that comes from a deliberate press, not a faulty wire, and the emptiness outside carried a peculiar certainty that someone had been there only moments before. I told myself not to dwell on it, but the next night, at the same quiet moment, the bell rang again. This time I paused in the hallway longer, letting the silence after the chime seep into me. My hand hovered over the knob. I felt the faint vibration of the door beneath my palm, as though the wood itself remembered the pressure of the bell. When I opened the door, the porch was empty again, and again no footprints disturbed the dew. By the third night, I could not pretend the pattern was coincidence. I sat in the dark living room, blanket pushed aside, hands folded tightly in my lap. I watched the clock as its hands crawled toward the familiar moment. My breath grew shallow, not from fear, but from a sense of being observed by something I could not name. When the bell rang, it vibrated through the room like a small shock. I opened the door quickly that time, almost catching the air before it settled back into stillness. Still no one. Still no trace. I closed the door more slowly that night. My body felt heavy with a knowledge I was not ready to articulate. I slept poorly, waking often, listening to every sound the house offered. The next morning, I called my daughter. "There has been someone at the door these past nights," I said, keeping my voice even, always at the same time. She exhaled softly, that delicate sigh grown children sometimes use with aging parents. "Mom," she said gently, "maybe you were dreaming. The nights feel long in winter." "I was awake," I replied. "I am sure you thought you were," she said with a soft laugh, though I heard the impatience beneath it. You know how the mind plays tricks. When she visited later that week, she walked to the front porch with exaggerated care, scanning the path as though performing an inspection for my benefit. "There is nothing here," she said, spreading her hands. "I know," I said quietly. "That is the part I am trying to understand." My son came by the next evening. He checked the doorbell, pressing it once. The chime echoed through the house in that familiar tone. He nodded. "Works fine." "I am not questioning whether it works," I said. He smiled lightly, patting my shoulder. "You worry too much. Maybe it was an animal brushing it somehow." "Animals cannot reach the bell," I replied calmly. "Maybe the wind," he said. "Maybe you heard something else and thought—" "I am not imagining it," I said softly. He paused then, just long enough to show he had heard the firmness in my tone. But rather than acknowledge it, he gave me a careful smile. "Let us keep an eye on it," he said. "In the meantime, maybe take the sleep aid your doctor mentioned." The suggestion bothered me more than the bell. I had told him nothing about struggling to sleep. Yet there he was, nudging me toward a narrative of confusion. By the end of the week, the bell had rung every night. Always one chime. Always the same moment. Always followed by silence that felt too deliberate to be natural. My children repeated their reassurances with that same careful gentleness that does not comfort but dismisses. My daughter placed a hand on the back of my neck and said, "You are under more stress than you realize." My son touched my arm and murmured, "There is no shame in getting older." They spoke as though my senses were softening, but they did not know the decades they spoke over. Women who have lived as long as I have do not lose awareness. We sharpen it. One evening, after my daughter left, I sat alone with the lamp turned low. The house creaked softly as the wind pressed against its siding. I felt a familiar tension settle across my shoulders. I had felt it before in hospitals when my husband was unwell, in courtrooms when I signed documents neither of us wanted to face, in the quiet hours of dawn when life shifted beneath my feet. It was the tension that arrives when truth is near. That night, before the bell rang, I moved toward the door quietly and placed my hand on the knob. I did not open it. I simply waited. My breath came slowly. The clock's ticking grew louder, matching the steady beat of my pulse. Then, as though answering a silent invitation, the bell chimed. I froze. The air on the other side of the door felt charged, warmer than the hallway. I could sense the presence of someone standing just beyond the frame, not moving, not backing away. For a moment, I imagined I felt the faint reverberation of their breath against the wood. But when I opened the door, the world beyond was empty again. No wind, no footsteps, no movement, only a faint, lingering impression that someone had stood close enough to touch the door if they wished. I stepped back inside and locked the door slowly. My hands did not shake, though my heartbeat quickened. Fear had not taken hold. What I felt was something different, something older. A slow, quiet recognition rising from a place I had not visited in years. The next morning, I called my children and told them I wanted to install a small camera by the door. Nothing elaborate, just enough to record the nights. They resisted instantly. "You do not need all that," my daughter insisted. "It will only feed your anxiety," my son said. Their refusal came too quickly, too confidently, as though they shared a knowledge I did not yet have. And for the first time, I wondered whether their certainty was not born from disbelief, but from an understanding they had chosen not to give me. I will handle it, I said quietly, ending the conversation. Later that afternoon, a young technician from down the street helped me install a simple camera. He tested it twice. The footage was clear. When he left, the house felt different again. Not safer, simply ready. That night, I sat in my chair, camera watching silently from the porch. I did not move when the clock approached the familiar moment. I kept my hands folded, my breath steady. The bell rang exactly as it always did, sharp and deliberate. I did not rise, I did not open the door. I simply watched the shadows shift across the room. And in that stillness, I felt something deeper than fear. I felt confirmation. The world beyond the door was not empty. The mystery was not imagined. The presence was real. The only question left was why my children seemed so desperate for me not to discover who stood there. Though I did not understand the meaning then, I understand it far more now. The bell was never just a bell. It was the beginning, and someone out there knew exactly what they were doing. The morning after the camera recorded its first night, I stood at the kitchen counter stirring my tea, watching the steam rise in soft ribbons. The house felt different, as though it held its breath along with me. I had not yet looked at the footage. Part of me wanted to wait until daylight settled more firmly across the rooms. Another part wanted someone else in the house when I opened the file, but I knew my children would not give me the clarity I sought. They had already decided what I was allowed to believe. So I sat at the small kitchen table, glasses perched at the end of my nose, and opened the video slowly. The recording began with stillness. The porch light cast a soft glow across the boards. The bushes swayed gently in the wind, nothing unusual. Then the timestamp crept toward the familiar moment, and my breath grew shallow. A shadow entered the frame, or rather a shape. Human. Tall. Still. He stood close to the door, head tilted slightly as though listening for movement inside. His face hovered at the edge of the camera's range, partially obscured by the frame. I watched as he lifted his hand and pressed the bell with quiet certainty. He did not knock. He did not shift his weight. He simply stood there for several seconds, unmoving as though absorbing the silence inside. Then he turned and left. There was no sound of a gate opening, no rustle of gravel, no trailing footsteps. He walked away with a steadiness that made my skin tighten. I sat back slowly, the tea long forgotten. I replayed the recording. I watched the shape, the hand, the angle of the shoulders, the slight hesitation before he turned. Something about the movement tugged at an old memory I could not immediately grasp. I whispered to myself, I should have paid closer attention. Later that afternoon, my daughter visited. She placed a bag of groceries on the counter and began sorting them. Automatically, her movements familiar and efficient. "Mom," she said casually, "did you sleep better last night?" "I slept," I replied. She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You sound tired." "I am thinking," I said quietly. She slid a loaf of bread into the pantry. "About what?" "The bell," I replied. Her shoulders stiffened, a tiny motion she probably believed I would not notice. "We already talked about that." "I installed a camera," I said. She froze for a heartbeat, then forced a small laugh. "Oh, Mom, you really should not have done that." "It helps me understand what is happening," I said. "Or it feeds into your worries," she countered. "You know how imagination can run wild when the house is quiet." "My imagination did not install itself," I said softly. She gave me a thin smile, one that did not meet her eyes. "Let us not make this bigger than it is." The conversation lingered in the room long after she left. Her reaction had been too quick, too dismissive, as if she had rehearsed her responses. That evening, alone again, I looked around my living room the way one looks at a familiar place that has begun to shift underfoot. I traced the edges of the rug with my eyes, the framed photographs on the wall, the collection of books that had been my comfort since widowhood. In the months after my husband passed, this house had held me like an old friend. Now it felt as though it was holding something else too, something waiting to be named. I remembered the early days after he died, the meals relatives brought, the gentle touches on my shoulder, the quiet assurances that grief would soften. My children visited often, helping with mail, bills, repairs. They had been patient then, gentle. But as months turned into a year, their tone shifted. They began suggesting changes, small at first. You should not live alone in a house this size. You deserve a place with more support. Maybe it is time to simplify things. At first, I believed they were simply worried, but gradually the suggestions became more pointed, as though they were preparing me for a transition they had already decided upon. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was being uncharitable. Still, something in their voices stayed with me. The next morning, I re-watched the footage. The figure's hand lingered on the doorframe for a fraction longer than necessary. I felt a pull of recognition again, faint but persistent. A memory from years ago, perhaps. A gesture I had once known well. I whispered, "What are you trying to tell me?" Later that week, my son came by with a cheerful energy that felt forced. "Thought I would check on you," he said, setting a bag of fruit on the counter. "You came last week," I said gently. "Can never check too often," he laughed. His eyes, however, darted toward the hallway where the camera monitor sat. He did not acknowledge it, but his gaze lingered long enough for me to notice. I decided to test the waters. "I saw something on the footage," I said. He sighed immediately, as though exhausted by a conversation that had not yet happened. "Mom." "It is a person," I said quietly. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Maybe a delivery driver. Maybe a neighbor." "They ring once," I said. "At the same time, every night." "Coincidence," he replied quickly. "And they stand very close to the door," I added. "Maybe someone looking for the wrong house," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. I lifted my eyes to his. "Why does this bother you so much?" "It does not," he insisted. "I am concerned about you." "Concern does not look like fear," I said softly. He froze, a long stillness settling over him. Then he smiled too brightly as though resetting himself. "You are reading into things again." He left shortly after, but the tightness in his voice stayed with me. For the next few nights, the bell continued its pattern. Each time it rang, I sat in the dark hallway, close enough to sense the presence on the other side of the door without opening it. The air shifted subtly, as though the visitor carried a piece of the past with him each time he approached. One night, I whispered through the door, "Why are you coming here?" Of course, there was no answer, only silence, a silence that felt strangely familiar. The next day, I visited the small garden outside my bedroom window. As I trimmed a few dried stems, I noticed something odd. The soil near the back fence looked disturbed. Not heavily, just a faint shift as though someone had brushed against it or stepped lightly. I crouched down, brushing my fingers over the earth. It held no clear footprint, but it carried a quiet suggestion that it had been moved recently. "That moment should have warned me," I murmured. Inside the house again, I began paying closer attention. The soft creak of the floorboards, the faint click of the air system turning on, the way shadows stretched differently across the walls depending on the hour. Suspicion settled over my days in a slow, steady wave. One afternoon, as I sat by the window reading, I heard my children talking in low voices outside the hallway. They thought I was asleep. "She is fixating again," my daughter whispered. "She always does this when she is stressed," my son murmured back. "We need to redirect her." "Redirect?" she repeated softly. "She is our mother, not a patient." "That is not what I meant," he said. "I just do not want her to spiral." They paused, then my daughter sighed. "What if she brings it up to someone else? What if she starts asking questions?" "She will not," he said. "She trusts us." Their footsteps moved away. I sat perfectly still, book open in my lap, though I had not read a single word on the page. Trust is a delicate, thing. It can shift without sound. That evening, as twilight washed through the living room, I found myself thinking about my husband, the way he used to stand at the front door when expecting someone, the slight tilt of his head when listening, the way he rested his hand on the door frame almost exactly like the figure in the video. A memory surfaced then, one I had not touched in many years. My husband's troubled expression during a conversation we once had late at night, his voice low, almost pleading, as he asked me not to worry about certain things from his past, said he would handle them, said some truths were better left quiet. I had trusted him. I had not asked questions. But now, years later, someone had begun ringing my bell every night. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. I did not understand the meaning then, I whispered. The days passed quietly, though not peacefully. The sense of being watched grew sharper, as though I existed in the narrow space between past and present. I started writing small notes on slips of paper, times, thoughts, impressions. I tucked them into a drawer beside my bed. One morning, while washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. A woman with silver hair pulled into a loose knot, eyes steady, mouth pressed into a line that held more resolve than fear. I whispered to that reflection, I know what I know. Later, when the bell rang again at its familiar hour, I did not rise from my chair. I remained perfectly still, letting the chime echo through the house. My breath slowed, my hands steadied. I understood now that the danger was not in the sound of the bell. The danger was in the silence that followed, and the truth waiting behind it. The morning I decided to review the camera footage again, the house felt colder than usual. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the rug. The file sat open on the screen, paused at the moment before the visitor appeared. I hesitated, letting the silence settle. Then I pressed play. The porch came into view, the boards faintly illuminated by the overhead light. A soft breeze moved the bushes along the walkway. Nothing unusual. But as the time approached the familiar point, a prickle of awareness rose along the back of my neck. The figure entered the frame again. He moved with quiet certainty, stepping close to the door with that same deliberate grace. His face remained half hidden by the edge of the frame, as though he knew exactly where the camera could not reach. He lifted his hand, pressed the bell, then stood utterly still. The stillness carried weight, as though he was listening for something only he expected to hear. But it was not the bell that caught my breath this time. It was the hand, the shape of it, the way the fingers curled slightly at rest, the faint tremor in the knuckles, the soft hesitation before lowering the arm. A memory rose, slowly, uninvited. My husband standing at the front door on early mornings, waiting for deliveries during his last year. The subtle shake in his hand when he believed no one was looking. The slight drag of his finger along the wood grain of the doorframe. The visitor's gesture mirrored his almost perfectly. I leaned back in my chair, heart beating a little faster, the realization stirring at the edge of understanding. It was not that the figure resembled my husband physically. It was the familiarity in movement, as though he had learned certain habits from someone I once knew well. A soft whisper escaped my lips. "Who taught you to move that way?" I played the video again, pausing when the hand rested against the frame. I zoomed in slightly, though the quality blurred the finer details. Still, I noticed something I had missed before. The visitor wore a ring, a simple band, plain metal, a little worn but unmistakably deliberate. My husband had a similar ring, though his had been engraved on the inside. He never removed it, even when his fingers swelled, even when the doctors suggested taking it off. After he passed, I kept it in a small wooden box in my dresser. I stood and walked to the bedroom, opening the drawer where the ring lay. I held it in my palm, letting the weight settle. I traced the engraving with my fingertips. Then I whispered, "This cannot be coincidence." When I returned to the living room, I played the recording again, feeling an uneasiness deepen in my chest. The visitor turned slightly before leaving, and for a brief moment the side of his face moved closer to the edge of the frame. I paused the video there. Something about the jawline, something about the way he held his shoulders, a familiarity I could not fully place. I whispered, I should have paid closer attention. Later that afternoon, my daughter came by with a container of soup. She placed it on the kitchen counter and asked how I had been sleeping. Well enough, I said. Her eyes shifted toward the hallway where the camera monitor sat. You have not been obsessing over that again, have you? I watch it, I said, because it shows the truth. She sighed, pulling out a chair. Mom, you are going to make yourself anxious. There is nothing on those recordings except shadows and leaves moving in the wind. I saw the visitor, I said quietly, more clearly this time. She went still, her hand frozen halfway to the chair back. Visitor, she repeated, forcing a small smile. That word makes it sound like someone you know. Perhaps I do, I murmured. She sat down slowly, folding her hands. Mom, dreams can feel real. Memories can blend with shadows. Sometimes you see what you expect to see. I expect nothing, I said gently, but I do not confuse shadows with people. Her voice tightened. Please do not let your mind wander into things that are not real. What if they are very real? I asked softly. Her throat worked as though swallowing a difficult truth. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, then closed it. After a moment, she stood abruptly. I will come by later, she said. Try to rest. When she left, the door closed with a quiet finality. Her reaction unsettled me more than the visitor. That evening, I sat in my living room watching the sunset spread across the sky in muted gold. As the light faded, a memory surfaced uninvited, a conversation I had once overheard between my husband and a man whose voice I had never identified. I'd been in the kitchen, washing dishes, when my husband lowered his voice so suddenly that I turned off the faucet to listen. It is better she does not know, he had said. She has been through enough. Promise me you will keep your distance. Those words came back to me now with unsettling clarity. Keep your distance. Better she does not know. A soft chill moved through me. I whispered, What did you hide from me? As night settled across the house, I felt a quiet certainty growing inside me. Not fear this time. Something else. Something older and steadier. The feeling of a woman who has lived long enough to know when a truth is circling close. I did not turn on the hallway light when the familiar moment approached. I wanted to watch the shadows without altering the room. I sat in my chair, the blanket draped over my knees, breathing evenly. The bell rang, one sharp, familiar chime. I remained perfectly still, no movement, no reaction, only listening. After several seconds, the air near the door shifted. A presence, a weight, the kind you cannot see but can sense through the smallest tremor of awareness. I did not rise. I did not open the door. Instead, I breathed slowly and let the moment pass. Later, I replayed the footage. The visitor had leaned closer to the door that night, as though listening for signs of life inside. His head tilted in the same gentle angle my husband used when trying to hear a faint sound. A soft whisper left me. You know me. The next day, I needed clarity beyond my children's guarded responses. I called my neighbor, a kind woman whose daughter studied computer work. She came over in the early evening, taking a seat on the couch while I showed her the recordings. She watched quietly, her eyes narrowing in concentration. This is not a glitch, she said finally. Her voice carried no doubt. I know, I whispered, and this person knows exactly where the camera will lose part of the face. My heart tightened. What does that mean? It means whoever this is. They are not just wandering by. She paused. It feels intentional. When she left, the living room felt both lighter and heavier at once. I had confirmation. The visitor was real, the pattern was deliberate, and the familiarity was not a trick of my mind. I sat down at my desk and opened the small, wooden box where I kept some of my husband's old letters and papers. I had not looked through them in years. Grief had made it difficult for a long time, but now I needed answers. Inside the box were envelopes, receipts, faded photographs, and a folded piece of paper with writing on the front in my husband's careful hand. A name, not mine, not his, another man's. I unfolded it slowly. A short note inside, a date, a few words about a promise, written in the quiet tone my husband rarely used unless something weighed heavily on him. I whispered, "I did not understand the meaning then." The name echoed in my mind like a bell of its own. I had heard it once in my life, many years ago, spoken during that hushed conversation I had overheard. I closed the box and exhaled. Clarity settled into me with a slow, steady certainty. I was not losing my mind. I was not imagining the bell. The nightly visitor was someone tied to my husband's unfinished past, someone my children recognized, someone my husband had asked them to keep away from me. And now that I had seen him, truly seen him, something in me shifted. I no longer felt like prey waiting in the dark. I felt like a woman stepping quietly into the truth, a truth my children believed they could protect me from, a truth my husband thought better left hidden. I whispered into the empty room, "I am not the woman you underestimated." The bell had not been calling me toward fear. It had been calling me toward recognition. If only I had understood that sooner. I woke with a steadiness I had not felt in a long time. For weeks, the bell had shaped my nights, but now the quiet knowledge of what it meant shaped my days. The visitor was real. His pattern was real. The familiarity in his movements was real. And my children's reactions, those subtle shifts in their voices, the guarded glances at the monitor, were no accident. Clarity has a way of rearranging the air around a woman. You begin to hear things differently, notice small changes in tone, understand pauses that once seemed insignificant. You also begin to see yourself more clearly, not as someone slipping, but as someone sharpening. That morning I stood at the window watching the light settle softly across the yard. The dew shimmered faintly on the grass. The world looked deceptively peaceful, but underneath something was shifting. I whispered, "I am not afraid of truth." The house felt lighter for the first time in weeks. I made tea and carried it to the front room where the camera monitor rested on the small table. Instead of replaying old footage, I simply placed my hand on the edge of the table and breathed slowly. The presence behind the door no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a question that had waited long enough to be answered. I decided not to open the footage again that morning. Strategy is not always in action. Sometimes it is in stillness. Sometimes it is in letting thoughts settle until they stop shaking. Around midday, my daughter arrived unexpectedly. Her knock was brisk, as though her hand carried more urgency than she intended to show. When I opened the door, she stepped in with a too bright smile and a container of soup in her hand. "I brought lunch," she said, setting the container on the counter. "That is kind," I said. She fussed with a spoon, stirring the soup, though it was not yet warm. Her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. "You have been awfully quiet lately," she said, "not calling much." "I have been thinking," I replied. Her shoulders tensed. "Thinking about what?" "The visitor," I said softly. She shut the container lid too quickly. "Mom." "I saw something in the footage," I continued. Her back stiffened. "We need to talk about this." I folded my hands gently. "I am listening." She turned to face me, the brightness in her expression fading into something strained. "You are letting imagination fill in the blanks. You have been alone too much. You are reading into shadows. This fixation is not healthy." "Healthy," I repeated calmly. "Is truth unhealthy?" She sighed. "It is not truth. "It is on the recordings," I said. "The camera distorts things," she insisted. "The camera is clearer than your tone," I replied. She blinked, caught off guard. A faint tremor passed through her fingers as she placed the spoon down. "Mom," she said quietly, "you are making this harder than it needs to be." "For whom?" I asked softly. She did not answer. For a long moment, the silence settled between us like a heavy blanket. Then she stepped back, smoothing her hair. "I have to go," she whispered. "We will talk another time." I watched her cross the lawn, her steps quick, her shoulders tense. Something about the way she got into her car told me she was not simply worried for me. She was worried about what I might uncover. That afternoon, I walked through the house slowly, touching the edges of furniture, brushing my hand along door frames, pausing in rooms that held memories of my husband. The faint scent of his old cologne still lingered in the back bedroom where he used to store his jackets. I opened the closet and pressed my fingers to the worn fabric of his favorite coat. "Who did you keep hidden from me?" I whispered. The air felt charged, as though holding an answer just out of reach. In the late afternoon, the neighbor's daughter, kind, patient, quietly perceptive, stopped by with a small plate of cookies. She glanced at the camera monitor and then at me. "You watched it again?" she asked. "Not today," I said. "Today I just sat with the knowledge." She smiled gently. "Sometimes that is harder." "It is also necessary," I said. She hesitated, then sat across from me. "I asked my father about the pattern," she said. "He used to work security. He said when someone repeats a behavior at the same time every night, it means one of two things." "What are they?" I asked. "Either they are reenacting something from their past," she said softly, "or they are waiting for a signal that never comes." A cool shiver ran through me. She placed her hand on mine for a moment before standing. "I will check in on you tomorrow," she said. After she left, I sat in the quiet for a long while, letting her words sink into me, reenacting the past, waiting for a signal. Both possibilities felt unsettlingly close to what I had witnessed. As evening approached, I lit a small lamp in the living room. The warm glow washed the walls in gentle amber. I felt less like a woman hiding from fear and more like someone walking toward understanding. Around dusk, my son knocked on the door. He entered without waiting for my invitation, his eyes scanning the room quickly before resting on me. "I heard you talk to your sister," he said. "I did," I replied. "She is worried," he said. "You are getting stuck in your head again." I tilted my head slightly. "That is a convenient explanation." He frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You want me to doubt myself," I said, "so I will not ask questions." His jaw tightened. "You are imagining things again, Mom." "I imagine nothing," I said calmly. "I listen, I observe, I notice." He took a breath as though preparing for a speech. "This stress is not good for you. You need to let this go." "Why?" I asked softly. "Because you say so?" He looked at the floor, then at the wall, anywhere but at me. "You are spiraling." "No," I said. "I am waking up." His face paled slightly. Something flickered across his features. Recognition, fear, guilt, I could not yet tell. But it was enough to confirm what I had suspected. My children were not simply dismissing my fears. They were concealing something. He left in a hurry, muttering something about checking on me tomorrow. When the door closed, I felt a slow calm settle across my shoulders. Their reactions were no longer confusing. They were illuminating. I spent that night preparing emotionally, not physically. Quiet preparation looks different for a woman my age. It is not in dramatic gestures or hurried movements. It is in reflection, in choosing steadiness, in deciding that truth will not be forced or feared, only received on my terms. I sat at my desk and opened my husband's old box again. I read his notes slowly, tracing the familiar curves of his handwriting. "I will handle it. Better she does not know." "I know now," I whispered. and I am not afraid. Later, when the familiar moment approached, I walked to the hallway and stood near the door, my ear tilted slightly toward the wood. I did not hide. I did not hold my breath. I stood in the open, steady and aware. The bell rang. One sharp chime, a sound that had once filled me with dread but now carried a strange clarity. I could feel him standing on the other side of the door, not from fear but from the air itself. Presence has weight. You learn this as you age. You learn to feel people even when you cannot see them. I whispered softly through the door, "Why do you come?" For a moment the air thickened, as though my words had reached him. The presence lingered longer than before. Then gradually it faded, leaving the hallway still. I returned to my chair and sat down slowly, feeling the small victory of my own courage. The fear that once tightened around my chest had loosened, replaced by an understanding that the visitor wanted something, but not violence, not harm. He wanted recognition, and recognition requires truth. The next morning, I made a quiet decision. I would no longer present myself as uncertain. I would not ask my children if they believed me. I would show them through steadiness that I believed myself. I brewed tea, straightened the living room, opened the curtains, and walked through the house with a calm certainty that surprised even me. Strategizing for a woman my age is not a matter of plotting. It is a matter of reclaiming. I reclaimed my presence, my voice, my awareness, my right to understand the pieces of my own life that others had chosen to guard. As I passed the hallway, I paused near the door. My fingers brushed the cool surface of the wood. "I am ready," I whispered, "not for a confrontation, not for a fight, but for the truth." And somewhere in the back of my mind, I felt a twinge of quiet anticipation, almost as if the visitor had been waiting for this moment too. But fear no longer governed me. Truth did. The morning I chose to confront my children, the house felt strangely gentle, as though it sensed the shift inside me. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in soft strips, warming the floorboards beneath my feet. I moved slowly through each room, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. There are moments in life when a woman must step into her own steadiness, and I understood that this was one of them. I brewed tea, let it steep, and poured 2 cups, one for myself and one in case the moment required sharing. Then I placed the cups on the living room table and turned on the small lamp, letting its glow soften the shadows in the corners. I picked up the phone and called my daughter. "Can you come by this afternoon?" I asked, my voice even. There was a pause on the line. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," I said. "I simply need us to talk." Her breath hitched faintly. "I will be there." When I hung up, I called my son next. "I would like to see you," I said. He hesitated longer than his sister had. "Should I bring anything?" "No," I said gently. "Just your presence." He agreed to come. Before they arrived, I called my neighbor's daughter, the one who had shown me how to review the footage properly. I asked if she could stop by and sit with me for a little while. "I can," she said. "Do you want company?" "Company would be steadying," I replied. When she arrived, she settled beside me quietly, her presence calm and unobtrusive. I explained that I asked her to sit in simply because sometimes conversations flow more truthfully when someone neutral is near. She nodded, understanding without judging. When the bell rang, my actual doorbell, not the nightly chime, I felt a small, steady breath move through me. My daughter entered first. She walked into the room and paused, seeing the neighbor's daughter there. Something flickered across her face, uncertainty, caution, perhaps even guilt, but she forced a small smile. "Mom," she said softly, "you look composed." "I am," I replied. My son arrived shortly after, stepping inside with a guarded expression. His hand tightened briefly on the back of a chair before he sat down. I took my seat across from them, folding my hands in my lap. "We need to speak plainly today," I said gently. My daughter shifted. "About what?" "The visitor," I said. Their reactions were immediate, though carefully concealed. Their shoulders stiffened. My son's jaw tightened. A silence settled in the room, dense and telling. I spoke softly. "I know someone has been ringing my bell nightly." "Mom," my daughter began. "I know someone stands at my door," I continued. "I know he waits, I know he listens, and I know he leaves without being seen." My son opened his mouth, but I raised my hand slightly. "I also know he is connected to your father." A long, trembling stillness filled the room. My daughter closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. My son exhaled slowly, sinking slightly into his chair. Their silence confirmed more than words ever could. I reached for the small remote and pressed play. The visitor appeared on the screen, his form half cut by the camera's limited view. The familiar tilt of the head, the hand resting against the frame, the stillness after the bell. I watched my children, not the screen. My daughter whispered, barely audible, "He came again?" "Yes," I said, "and each time you both found ways to convince me I was imagining it." My son rubbed his temples. "Mom, you were grieving. We were trying to protect you from stress." "Protection is not silence," I said gently. "Protection is honesty." He swallowed hard. "You do not understand." "I understand more than you believe," I replied. "I found your father's note. I heard your phone call, and I know the name that haunted him." My daughter's eyes widened in shock. "You listened?" "No," I said softly. "I remembered." The neighbor's daughter shifted slightly, her presence grounding the moment without interfering. My son finally spoke. His voice was low, as though reluctant to release the truth. "His name is Ray," he said. A quiet hush fell over the room at the sound of the name. "He and Dad grew up together," my son continued. "They made a mistake when they were young, a serious one. Dad spent his whole life trying to make amends. That man never let it go." My daughter added in a trembling voice, "He kept showing up over the years, sometimes to ask for help, sometimes to bring up the past. Dad asked us to keep him away from you after he passed." I sat very still, absorbing their words. "What did my husband owe him?" I asked. My daughter exchanged a glance with her brother. My son answered quietly, "Dad never told us exactly, only that it involved a moment he regretted, a moment he never wanted to define your marriage." "And what does this man want now?" I asked. My son hesitated before saying, "Closure, or apology, or recognition. We never knew for certain." I breathed slowly. "And what did you think I needed protection from?" My daughter's voice cracked. "From knowing Dad had a past he never shared, from questions we could not answer, from the fear that this man might bring chaos into your life now that Dad is gone. And instead," I said quietly, "you brought confusion." My son looked down, ashamed. "We handled it poorly." I nodded. "You handled it quietly. I understand why, but I will not be managed." A soft tremor passed through the room. My children sat smaller, humbled by the calm truth in my voice. I turned to the neighbor's daughter. "Would you mind stepping out for a moment, dear?" She nodded and quietly left the room. When the door clicked shut, I faced my children again. "I am not angry," I said softly, "but I am disappointed. You tried to shield me from my own life. You tried to decide what truths I deserved." My daughter's eyes filled. "We were afraid." "Fear," I said gently, "is not a foundation for decision-making." My son whispered, "What do you want us to do?" "The truth," I said, "all of it." He took a deep breath. "Ray comes at that hour because that was when he and Dad used to meet when they were young. It was their signal. It meant they needed to talk. He kept the habit. Even after all these years." I felt a heavy understanding settle into my bones. "He comes," my son continued, "not to frighten you, but because he believes your father left something unfinished. And did he? I asked quietly. My son hesitated. Maybe, maybe not, but he believes he did. My daughter wiped her eyes. We should have told you. We just did not know how. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing this revelation. The visitor was not a ghost from some unknown world. He was a man holding a thread that tied back to my husband's youth, a thread my children had tried to cut. I would like to speak with him, I said. Both my children's eyes widened in alarm. Not alone, I added. Not impulsively, with a witness, with steady boundaries. But I want to understand the shape of your father's life before mine. I want to know the truth, even if it is complicated. My daughter whispered, "We tried to spare you that." "You tried to spare me from knowing my own husband," I said gently. "That is not sparing. That is erasing." My son closed his eyes, shame pulling at the edges of his expression. "We will help. We will talk to him. We will arrange it safely." I nodded. Good. Silence settled around us, the kind that does not suffocate but shifts things softly into place. "I do not seek confrontation," I said. "Only clarity, and now that we are here, let this be the moment we choose honesty over fear." My daughter reached for my hand. "We are sorry." "I know," I whispered, "and I forgive the intention, but not the action." My son bowed his head. "We will do better." Something inside me relaxed, a slow, steady easing of tension that had lived beneath my ribs since the first night the bell rang. I looked toward the hallway where the faint outline of the front door stood in the dim light. The visitor was not the threat, I said softly. The silence was. The days after our conversation passed with a gentleness I had not felt in months. It was not relief, exactly. Relief is too sudden, too eager. What I felt was something slower, something that moved through me like warm water, finding its way into cold places. A quiet settling of truth. My children came by more often that week, not with the nervous brightness they had worn before, not scanning the corners of the room for signs of my confusion, not speaking in careful tones designed to steer my thoughts. They came with something softer, humility, honesty, a desire to rebuild what silence had cracked. We sat at the kitchen table one morning, the three of us, sharing a pot of tea. The light moved across the table in a soft arc as the hours passed. My daughter spoke first. "We never wanted to treat you like someone fragile," she said, staring down at her hands. "We wanted to protect you from a story we did not fully understand." My son nodded, his voice low. "Dad made it sound like a burden, something he carried alone. We were only trying to honor that." I listened without interruption. Age teaches you when not to fill the silence. After a moment, I touched my daughter's hand. "You tried to protect me from pain," I said, "but in doing so, you planted a different kind of pain." She lowered her gaze. "We know." My son took a breath. "We are trying to make it right." "You are," I said gently, "and I see that." We spoke for a long time that morning, not about the visitor, not about the past, but about us, about trust, about how easily it can shift, even in families that believe they know each other well. It was a conversation we should have had years ago, yet I understood that sometimes truth waits for a certain season in a family's life, a season when all parties are quiet enough to hear each other. By the afternoon, they left with softer expressions than when they arrived. I watched them walk down the path to their cars, noticing something I had missed in earlier weeks. Their fear had not been of the visitor. It had been of disappointing me, of failing to carry the weight of their father's instruction, of admitting they did not know how to navigate a secret that never belonged to them. I whispered to myself, "We are all learning." That night, I sat in the living room with the lamp turned low. The familiar minute approached. I did not feel dread this time. I felt something closer to acceptance. If the bell rang, I would hear it with a different understanding. If it did not, the silence would hold its own meaning. When the moment arrived, the house remained still. No chime, no presence pressing against the door, only the soft hum of the heater and the rustle of branches outside. I breathed slowly. The quiet felt earned. For several nights, the same silence returned. I still sat awake at the familiar hour, listening to the space beyond the door. Not out of fear, out of acknowledgement, out of respect for whatever unfinished conversation had brought that man to my porch. But he did not return. Perhaps he had seen the shift inside the house. Perhaps my children had spoken to him, as they promised. Perhaps he recognized that whatever history he carried belonged to a chapter I could not rewrite, only understand with grace. Or perhaps he had come for something simple, recognition, and once he sensed he had been finally seen, he stepped back into his own life. I will never know the full truth, and I have learned to live peacefully with that. On the fourth morning without the chime, I took a walk through my yard. The dew glistened on the grass, bright and clean. I ran my fingers along the fence, the wood cool beneath my touch. I paused by the place where the earth had once looked faintly disturbed. It was smooth now, rested, settled. I whispered, "We all return to stillness when we are ready." The days that followed unfolded with an unusual softness. My children began calling not to check on my state of mind, but simply to talk. My daughter brought over a new plant for the windowsill. My son helped me adjust a loose shutter that had bothered me for weeks. We began rebuilding trust, thread by thread, slowly, gently, without rushing. One afternoon, my daughter asked if I wanted to talk more about the man who came to the door. I shook my head. "I know enough." She nodded without pressing further. It was the first time she allowed my boundary without reshaping it. Later that evening, I took out my husband's ring from the drawer where I kept it. I held it in my palm, feeling the familiar weight of it. It was neither heavy nor light, just present, like the memories we keep not because they are perfect, but because they are ours. "I wish you had told me," I whispered into the quiet room, but I did not say it with anger. I said it with the understanding of a woman who has lived long enough to know that people hide certain truths, not to deceive, but to preserve the peace of those they love. My husband had carried something he believed was his burden alone. I had carried the consequences of that belief, and my children had carried the fear of mishandling it. We were all shaped by the same silence, each in different ways. In the gentle days that followed, I noticed my posture had changed. My shoulders rested differently, no longer curled inward with uncertainty. My breath moved more freely. My steps felt grounded. I had not realized how much the nightly chime had influenced my body until it stopped. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sky darken slowly. A soft breeze brushed against my hair. The house behind me hummed with the familiar sounds of living, and I felt a sense of ownership over my life that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with clarity. Aging does not reduce a woman, it reveals her. It strips away the noise of others' expectations and leaves behind the steady truth of who she has always been. I smiled gently, touching the wooden railing beside me. "I know myself," I whispered, "and that is enough." My children eventually came to understand that honesty is a kind of respect. They began sharing more about their father's early years, stories he had never told me, stories he had told only them. Some were heavy, some were tender, some were complicated in ways that made all three of us sit in silence afterward. But silence felt different now, not hiding, holding. I learned that the visitor had been contacted. He had agreed not to come anymore. He wanted closure more than confrontation, and he had received it in the quiet way some men do, without ceremony, without explanation, simply by knowing that the truth had finally surfaced. In the weeks that passed, the night regained its stillness. I no longer waited for the bell. I slept undisturbed. I woke with a lightness that surprised me each morning. but sometimes in the soft hour before dawn, I sit in the living room and watch the shadows stretch across the rug. I think about the man who stood at my door. I think about the weight of old promises. I think about the reasons people hide the past and the courage it takes to face it. And I find myself grateful, not for the fear, not for the secrecy, but for the clarity that followed. My life is quieter now, not empty, just settled. And in that quiet, I have discovered something steady and true. A woman my age does not fear truth. She fears only being denied it. Now that the truth is mine again, I carry it not as a burden, but as a reminder. Our past does not disappear when others hide it. It simply waits for the right moment to be seen, and I finally saw mine,